Yeah, thanks, Tommy, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I told Tommy, give me a 10-second introduction, not a 2-minute introduction, but I appreciate it very much. And let me just tell you, it's a real honor for us to be here today and for me to be able to share with you a little bit about our Cottingham family. And, of course, we're going to maybe entertain you a little bit. I hope it'll be pretty good. My brothers sing a little better than I do. But I'm real pleased to have a lot of our family here. But especially, let me tell you, I'm surprised and really honored. About halfway back on this side, several of others who grew up in this church, I'm just surprised and truly honored that all of you are here. And I've got to be careful what I say because some of them were in our Sunday school classes up here, and I was a troublemaker from time to time. But so I've got to make sure they don't blow the whistle on me at this point. A little bit about Cottinghams. Dolph Brady, in his history of the church, started with a tribute to Will Carter. Will, he said, was the founder, promoter, and instigator of both the first church down at the courthouse site, the second church that was here and burned, and this third church. But let me tell you the rest of the story. Will was married to Mary Catherine Cottingham. And back in that day, ladies, women didn't get much credit for anything. At that time, women couldn't vote. And the Methodist Church still followed pretty much the teachings of Paul, that women could not have leadership roles in church. In fact, Paul even said, don't talk here, go home and ask your husband about it. But women could not have a leadership role at all. But the rest of the story is this. My grandmother knew both Will and Mary Catherine real well. And she told me more than once that even though Will got the credit, Mary Catherine Cottingham Carter was the real founder of this church. So you women remember that. Will and Mary Catherine had several children. The oldest was Andrew. And we got here a little bit early today, and I was walking around, and I looked, and there's a plaque back here in honor of Andrew. Well, first of all, let me tell you about Andrew. Andrew was the oldest son of Will and Mary Catherine Cottingham Carter. And Andrew was the sexton for the first church up at the courthouse site. And he built the fires. Of course, they had fireplaces, and he built the fires, cleaned the church for a whopping compensation of $1 silver per month. But Andrew went on and did a little better things. He and his younger brother Will went to the Naval Academy, and it's rare to have two brothers, both to make admiral in the Navy. But Andrew and brother Will were both Navy admirals. And I can remember in the late 50s, I think, when Andrew moved back here to Dillon, and his wife, Chelis, actually built the parsonage in 67, 68 or so, and the parsonage was built in honor of Admiral Andrew Carter. So it's obvious that he must have made a little more than $1 a month a little later on in his life. One other thing, the Carters had several children. Another one that I'm sure some of you remember was Mary Cottingham Carter. Mary Carter was a little bitty woman, only stood about 4'6" and maybe weighed 80 pounds. Some of you correct me if those who remember her. But don't let her small size fool you. Mary Cottingham Carter was a firecracker, I'll just tell you. And the one thing that I remember most about cousin Mary Carter was that she could really use 4-letter words with the best of them. And Mary rarely held back. I mean, she was just this little bitty thing. I can remember going to visit her a time or two with my grandmother, and Mary would enhance her conversation with some 4-letter. My grandmother would just cringe. I used to sit there and get such a kick out of it. One other thing about Mary, she used to sit right over here on about the third pew, 2 or 3 seats in, and I see cousin Margaret is nodding in agreement. Mary sat right over there. And heaven help anybody who took her spot on a Sunday morning. Moving on from Mary, by the way, Mary Catherine Cottingham Carter was the sister of our great-grandfather. And another brother was named Arch Cottingham. And Arch Cottingham owned this whole block. And when it was decided to move the church from the courthouse site to this site, Uncle Arch sold this half block where the church is and where the parking lot is, where the parsonage was when I was little, sold this half block to the church and built for himself at the same time his house over here on this corner where the playground is now. And of course, the parsonage then moved from back there at some point in the 60s, I think, over to this parsonage. And then when the new one was built, it moved from there. And I don't know exactly what's happened since then, but obviously neither parsonage is here today. But Arch, it's interesting to note, in his deed, when he deeded this half block to the church, reserved for himself the rights to water from an artesian well that was on this property to provide water for his house next door. And he had, according to Doff-Batty's history, Arch Cottingham had numerous leadership roles in the church and was the building committee chairman for this, the third church. So that was old Arch. Of course, he died a long time before I came along. I remember Mary, of course, and some others, but I don't remember great-great-uncle Arch. Back now to Will Carter for just a minute. Will, as well as being founder, initiator, and promoter of all three churches, was also the Sunday school superintendent. And the Sunday school classes then would all meet together. The young and the old, the whole church would meet for the first part of the Sunday school hour. And the Sunday school superintendent, Uncle Will, would lead the class in a devotional before they'd break up and go into their separate classrooms. And he would always do an object lesson, sort of like the object today was the Bible, I guess, pretty obvious object. But he would do an object lesson. He'd draw an object on the blackboard or have an object about which he'd build his lesson. Well, that obviously rubbed off on my Aunt Ruth Cottingham. And Maybeth was telling me this morning, and some others mentioned they remember, maybe it was Jacqueline, some others remember my Aunt Ruth, great Aunt Ruth. And by the way, I appreciate you mentioning Tommy Ernest Cottingham, her son. He was her only son who was killed in his first week or two in the Pacific in World War II. And Aunt Ruth used to look at me and sort of treat me, particularly when I was going over there and in Vietnam and going to places, sort of treated me almost like I was a replacement to her for her only son who was killed over there. And she was always just a delightful lady with a real sparkle in her eye. But she led our children's Sunday school classes, and we'd meet in this room up here. It's an activity room up here now, but just right over my back shoulder. The children's classes would meet there, and Aunt Ruth would do a devotional, and we'd sing some songs, and then we'd break up and go into separate rooms right down the line up here based on your class and age. And Aunt Ruth, too, picked it up, I'm sure, from Uncle Will, would use an object. And I want to tell you a story that I don't know whether it's true or not, but the truth is this, and it's about my Aunt Ruth and little Tommy Bethay. The truth sort of goes like this, but I don't know whether it's true or not. This is the truth. One Sunday, she was going to use a squirrel as an object lesson. So she told the children she was going to start describing something. As soon as they knew what it was, she wanted them to raise their hand. So she said, I'm thinking about something that's gray and lives in trees. Nobody raised their hands. She said, look, this thing eats nuts and has a long bushy tail. Nobody raised their hands. She was getting a little upset. She said, look, this thing gets excited. Finally, little Tommy slowly raised his hand. And he says, Ms. Cottingham, I know the answer has got to be Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. Moving on from Tommy and the object lessons, my grandmother and Granddaddy Lila Cottingham and grandmother Jenny were both very active in the church. Granddaddy Cottingham is mentioned many a time in Doff-Batty's history and leadership roles and taught the men's Sunday school class and other things. Our grandmother, his wife, our grandmother Jenny Cottingham also was very active. She taught the women's Sunday school class that met in this parlor room. It was older ladies then that met in that Sunday school class right through the double doors. And she was their teacher. She was also the president for several years of the Missionary Society, was president of the Methodist Women, and she had a circle named after her, and it's my understanding that circle, the Jenny Cottingham Circle, I think it's merged now maybe with another, but the Cottingham Circle is still an active circle in the church today. That's our grandmother, who was, of course, very active here. And incidentally, doesn't have anything directly to do with the church, but at the same time, early on, she was president of the Dillon Civic League. And she personally was responsible and directed the planting of all these little oak trees along all the streets in Dillon. And they were dug from Little Petey River Swamp and transferred up here. at the cost of 10 cents apiece. So that's also sort of a Cottingham heritage, I guess, or that she was primarily the primary driver for that. Next, you have Margaret's dad, James, and my dad, John C., who were their sons, and both were active and had leadership roles in the church. James, the name is on the World War II plaque, and both were on the official board and other things. But my dad's claim to fame was he and Mom sang in the choir for years. And my mom, when I was little, used to sing numerous solos, and I remember I'd sit down here with the young folks in the front, and I used to really be so proud when she sang those solos. I really thought she had the most beautiful voice in the world. I just really remember being proud of my mom. But Daddy's claim to fame was not so much his voice, but his naps and his longevity. Now, Daddy would sleep through the sermon almost every Sunday. You'd just see him go to sleep. It's just obvious. He'd just sleep. He could take power naps anywhere. Now, of course, Bruce, if you'd been the preacher, that never would have happened if you had been preaching when he was around. But he would sleep through the sermons. But it got worse. We were here one Sunday and came back, sitting out here, looked up, and doggone if he didn't sleep through the anthem as well as sleeping through the sermon. We knew then it was time for Daddy to retire. So the Dillon Herald must have really been hurting that week for news, because his retirement from the choir made the front page of the Dillon Herald. And the Baptists have nothing on us Methodists after that, because the headline read, "John the Methodist retires from the choir after 62 years." So Daddy retired after at least one Sunday of sleeping through the anthem. But and his napping was obvious to everybody, not just us, because Charles was here a year or two later and sitting on a back pew back here, opened the hymnal, and there was a little note in the hymnal that had some handwriting on it that had obviously been passed from one young person to another. And the note read, "Look at Mr. Cottingham." So let me tell you, I know our time's limited, so I've probably talked long enough. I could go on and on about a lot of things, Beth and Susan and others, all the activities we had as children here that really influenced our lives. So this church has had a major influence on me and all of our family, and I just want to say thanks. I can go back, and with Jack Lynn, I was looking at the list of preachers out here a little while ago, and I can remember distinctly Marvin Rast, who used to sing "Froggy Went A-Courtin' to the Children." I remember Carl Parker and all of his children who were about our age that lived in this parsonage. Then it moved over, and I can go on. Got a lot of stories I could tell you about my experiences then, but the church has really been just wonderful for our family, and I hope you'll see that our family, at least back years ago, did make some contributions to help make the Methodist Church what it is here now. So thanks very much for having us. We appreciate it.